Maya Thompson pulled her baseball cap down a little lower as she walked through the busy halls of Chicago O'Hare Airport. At 28, she looked even younger in her casual outfit, faded jeans, a simple gray hoodie, and worn sneakers. 2. Anyone watching, she seemed like just another college student heading home for the weekend, but Maya was far from ordinary. Hidden beneath her relaxed appearance was one of the sharpest minds in aviation safety. She held 2 master's degrees and had spent the last 6 years working her way up through the Federal Aviation Administration. Now, as a senior investigator, she specialized in something that made airlines nervous: civil rights compliance. Today wasn't a vacation. Maya was here on official business, conducting an undercover investigation that had been months in the planning. The FAA had received a disturbing number of complaints about discriminatory treatment at several major airports. Passengers reported being singled out, harassed, and treated unfairly based on their race, age, or appearance. The complaints painted a troubling picture of bias in the aviation industry. Maya's job was to see if these reports were true, and if they were, to gather the evidence needed to make real changes. She had chosen her outfit carefully. The hoodie was slightly oversized, making her look younger than her years. Her natural hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail under the cap. She carried a basic backpack instead of expensive luggage. Everything was designed to make her blend in as an ordinary young traveler who might be overlooked or dismissed by airport staff. As she made her way toward Gate B12, Maya's trained eyes were already at work. She watched how security personnel interacted with different passengers. She noticed which travelers got extra attention and which ones sailed through checkpoints without a second glance. Every interaction told a story, and Maya was an expert at reading between the lines. The terminal was buzzing with typical airport energy. Business travelers hurried past, checking their phones and pulling rolling suitcases. Families juggled children and carry-on bags while trying to find their gates. Elderly passengers moved more slowly, often looking confused by the maze of corridors and signs. Maya positioned herself near a coffee shop with a clear view of several gates. She ordered a simple black coffee and found a seat where she could observe without drawing attention. For the next hour, she watched and listened, taking mental notes about everything she saw. At Gate A7, she noticed an older white gentleman having trouble with his boarding pass. The gate agent immediately came around the counter to help him, speaking in kind, patient tones as she sorted out his seating assignment. The man smiled gratefully and thanked her multiple times. 20 minutes later, at the same gate, a young Hispanic mother with 2 small children approached with a similar problem. This time, the same gate agent barely looked up from her computer screen. She sighed heavily and spoke in short, irritated sentences. The mother had to ask twice before the agent finally, reluctantly, came around to help. The difference in treatment was subtle but unmistakable. Maya sipped her coffee and made mental notes. These small interactions might seem minor to casual observers, but they revealed important patterns. Bias often showed up in these everyday moments, in the tone of voice used, the level of patience shown, the basic respect offered to different people. Moving on, Maya walked slowly toward her actual gate. She had booked a real flight to Atlanta as part of her cover story. The ticket was legitimate, her passport was valid, and her travel plans were completely normal. But she knew that sometimes being completely legitimate wasn't enough to protect you from unfair treatment. Gate B12 was busy with passengers waiting for the 3:15 p.m. flight to Atlanta. Maya found a seat in the waiting area and continued her observations. The gate was staffed by a middle-aged woman named Patricia Williams, according to her name tag. Patricia appeared to be in her early 50s. With short brown hair and a crisp blue uniform, Maya watched Patricia interact with the stream of passengers. Approaching the counter, a well-dressed businessman asked about upgrading his seat. Patricia smiled warmly and spent several minutes checking options for him, even calling someone to see if better seats were available. Her customer service was excellent, friendly, helpful, and professional. Next came a young white woman with designer luggage asking about gate changes for her connecting flight. Again, Patricia was all smiles and helpfulness, even walking the passenger partway to point her in the right direction. But Maya began to notice something troubling. When a middle-aged black businessman approached with a question about his boarding group, Patricia's demeanor shifted noticeably. Her smile faded, her responses became shorter, and she seemed impatient with his questions. The man was polite and well-dressed, yet he received a completely different level of service. The pattern continued. Patricia was warm and accommodating with certain passengers while being cold and dismissive with others. The common thread was becoming impossible to ignore. Her treatment seemed to correlate strongly with the race and apparent economic status of the travelers. Maya felt a familiar mix of sadness and determination. This was exactly the kind of behavior the complaints had described. It wasn't outright hostility or obvious discrimination, it was subtler than that, but it was real and it was wrong. These small acts of bias added up to create an unwelcoming environment for travelers who deserved the same respect as everyone else. As boarding time approached, Maya gathered her simple backpack and joined the line of passengers. She had chosen to fly coach and dressed down specifically to test how she would be treated. Would Patricia's pattern of behavior continue when she reached the counter? The line moved slowly as Patricia checked boarding passes and IDs. Maya watched each interaction, noting the consistent pattern. Passengers who looked wealthy or white received smiles, small talk, and extra attention. Others got the bare minimum, a quick glance at their documents and a curt next. Maya's turn was approaching. She pulled out her boarding pass and passport, both completely legitimate and in perfect order. Her heart rate increased slightly, not from nervousness about flying, but from anticipation of what might happen next. As an investigator, she knew the importance of staying calm and professional regardless of how she was treated. She also knew that whatever happened in the next few minutes could provide crucial evidence in her investigation. Maya had recorded similar interactions at other airports, but none had been as clear-cut as what she was witnessing today. Patricia's behavior was a textbook example of the kind of discriminatory treatment that made air travel unpleasant and unfair for too many people. The passenger in front of her finished his transaction and moved toward the gate. Maya stepped forward, documents in hand, ready to see firsthand how Patricia would treat a young black woman traveling alone with basic luggage and casual clothes. What happened next would exceed even Maya's worst expectations and provide the Federal Aviation Administration with evidence that would change airport policies across the country. But in this moment, as she approached the counter with her valid passport and boarding pass, Maya had no idea that she was about to become the center of an incident that would shock everyone who witnessed it. Maya stepped up to the gate counter with her boarding pass and passport ready. She offered a polite smile, the same kind she had seen other passengers give throughout the afternoon. But the moment Patricia looked up and saw her, something changed. In the gate agent's expression, the warm, professional smile that Patricia had worn for the previous passengers vanished instantly. Her eyes narrowed as she looked Maya up and down, taking in the casual hoodie, the worn sneakers, and the simple backpack. It was as if she had already made up her mind about what kind of person Maya was before even looking at her documents. Boarding pass and ID, Patricia said flatly, extending her hand without making eye contact. Her tone was completely different from the friendly voice Maya had heard her use just minutes earlier with other travelers. Maya handed over her documents, maintaining her calm demeanor. As an investigator, she had trained herself to stay composed in difficult situations. But even with all her experience, she felt a knot forming in her stomach. The shift in Patricia's attitude was so dramatic and immediate that it caught her off guard. Patricia took the passport and boarding pass, but didn't give them the quick glance that other passengers had received. Instead, she held the passport up to the light, squinting at it suspiciously. She flipped through the pages slowly, examining each stamp and visa with exaggerated care. "This doesn't look right," Patricia muttered, though she hadn't found anything actually wrong with the document. Maya's passport was perfectly legitimate, issued by the U.S. State Department just 2 years earlier. It had been used for several international trips related to her work, and every stamp and marking was completely official. Maya watched Patricia's performance with growing amazement. The passport was in excellent condition, with clear photographs and all the proper security features. There was absolutely nothing suspicious about it. Yet Patricia continued to examine it as if she were a forensic expert investigating a crime. "Ma'am, is there a problem with my documents?" Maya asked politely. She kept her voice steady and respectful, exactly the way any innocent traveler would speak. Inside, though, she was carefully observing every detail of Patricia's behavior for her investigation. "Report, I'm just being thorough," Patricia replied, but her tone suggested something entirely different. She pulled out a small magnifying glass from under the counter and began examining the passport even more closely. The line of passengers behind Maya was starting to grow restless, and several people were checking their watches nervously. Maya glanced around and noticed that other passengers were beginning to stare. A businessman in an expensive suit tapped his foot impatiently. A family with young children looked confused about why the line had suddenly stopped moving. An elderly couple whispered to each other, clearly wondering what was causing the delay. What made the situation even more troubling was that Maya could see exactly what was happening. This wasn't about security or proper procedures. Patricia had processed dozens of passengers that afternoon without subjecting anyone else to this level of scrutiny. She had accepted boarding passes and IDs with barely a glance, offering smiles and pleasant conversation along the way. But now, faced with a young black woman in casual clothes, Patricia had suddenly become extremely concerned about document security. The double standard was so obvious that Maya wondered how Patricia had gotten away with this behavior for so long. "Where are you traveling to today?" Patricia asked, though the destination was clearly printed on both the boarding pass and the airport monitors. "Atlanta," Maya replied simply. She didn't elaborate or offer additional information, knowing that anything she said could be twisted or used against her. "What's the purpose of your trip?" Patricia continued, as if she were conducting an immigration interview instead of checking in a domestic passenger. "Personal business," Maya answered. Again, she kept her response brief and factual. She had every right to travel without explaining her reasons to a gate agent, and Patricia had no authority to demand detailed explanations from passengers, but Patricia wasn't satisfied with the answer. She set the passport down on the counter and fixed Maya with a stern look. "I'm going to need to see additional identification. This passport just doesn't seem authentic to me." Maya felt her pulse quicken, though she maintained her outward calm. The request was completely unreasonable and had no basis in airline policy or federal regulations. Passengers were required to show one form of government-issued photo ID for domestic flights, and Maya's passport more than satisfied that requirement. "I'm sorry, but this is a valid U.S. passport," Maya said, keeping her voice level. "It should be sufficient for domestic travel." Patricia's expression hardened. "I decide what's sufficient at my gate," she snapped. "If you can't provide additional ID, then you're not getting on this flight." The hostility in Patricia's voice was now unmistakable. Several passengers in line had pulled out their phones, sensing that something unusual was happening. Maya could see people starting to record, their faces showing confusion and concern about what they were witnessing. An older gentleman near the back of the line spoke up. "Excuse me, but is everything all right?" "The flight board's in 10 minutes. Patricia shot him an irritated look. "Everything is under control, sir. I'm just following proper security procedures." But Maya knew that nothing about this was proper procedure. She had flown hundreds of times for her work with the FAA and had never encountered anything like this level of harassment from airport personnel. Patricia was clearly making up rules as she went along, using her position of authority to intimidate and delay a passenger for no legitimate reason. "I understand your concern for security," Maya said carefully, "but I believe my passport meets all requirements for domestic travel. Could you please call your supervisor?" The request for a supervisor seemed to anger Patricia even more. Her face flushed red, and she leaned forward across the counter. "I don't need to call anyone? I'm telling you that this document looks fake, and I won't allow you to board with fraudulent identification." Maya's heart sank as she realized how far Patricia was willing to escalate the situation. The gate agent was now openly accusing her of attempting to travel with fake documents, despite having no evidence whatsoever to support such a claim. It was exactly the kind of discriminatory treatment that the FAA complaints had described. But seeing it happen in real time was still shocking. The passengers in line were becoming increasingly uncomfortable. Maya could hear whispered conversations and see people shaking their heads in disbelief. A young mother pulled her children closer, as if sensing that the situation was about to get worse. "Ma'am," Maya tried one more time, "I'd really appreciate if you could get your supervisor." I think there may be some confusion here, but Patricia was beyond reasoning. She had committed to her position and seemed determined to follow through, regardless of how unreasonable her demands had become. She picked up the phone at her station, but instead of calling a supervisor, she dialed a different number. "Security to Gate B12, she said into the phone, her voice loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "I have a passenger attempting to travel with suspicious documents." Maya felt the bottom drop out of her stomach. Patricia was calling airport security, escalating what should have been a simple document check into a potential criminal matter. Around her, she could hear gasps and murmurs from other passengers who couldn't believe what they were witnessing. The situation had spiraled completely out of control, and Maya knew that things were about to get much worse before they got better. The minutes that followed Patricia's security call felt like hours to Maya. She stood at the gate counter, surrounded by increasingly uncomfortable passengers, while Patricia glared at her with undisguised hostility. The boarding announcement for the Atlanta flight had come and gone, but no one was moving toward the gate. Everyone was too focused on the drama unfolding at the counter. Maya's mind raced as she considered her options. As an FAA investigator, she had dealt with difficult situations before, but never while undercover and never as the target of such blatant discrimination. Every instinct told her to reveal her identity and put an end to Patricia's behavior immediately. But she also knew that doing so might compromise her entire investigation. She decided to wait and see how far Patricia would push things. The evidence she was gathering could be crucial for protecting future travelers from similar treatment. Sometimes, unfortunately, you had to let injustice play out to fully document its extent. "I want everyone to know," Patricia announced loudly to the waiting passengers, "that we take security very seriously here. We won't allow people to board flights with fake documents, no matter what sob story they try to tell us." Maya felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and anger. Patricia was now openly humiliating her in front of dozens of strangers, making accusations that had no basis in reality. The passport in Patricia's hands was as real as the woman holding it, but facts seemed to matter very little in this situation. A well-dressed woman in the boarding line spoke up. "Excuse me, but what exactly is wrong with her passport?" "It looks fine to me," Patricia shot the woman a sharp look. "Ma'am, I'm trained to spot fraudulent documents. This passport has several irregularities that indicate it's not authentic." Maya almost laughed despite the seriousness of the situation. Patricia's claim about being trained to spot fraudulent documents was absurd. Gate agents received basic training on checking IDs, but they weren't document fraud experts. Patricia was making things up as she went along, using official-sounding language to justify her discriminatory behavior, but then Patricia did something that shocked even Maya, who thought she had seen the worst of human behavior in her years of investigating civil rights violations. Without warning, Patricia grabbed Maya's passport with both hands and tore it in half. The sound of ripping paper cut through the gate area like a gunshot. Passengers gasped audibly and several people immediately started recording with their phones. Maya stared in disbelief at her torn passport, the document that represented her citizenship and her right to travel freely in her own country. "That passport was obviously fake," Patricia declared, holding up the two halves as if they were evidence of a crime. "No real passport would tear that easily." Maya's hands trembled with rage, but she forced herself to remain calm. Patricia had just committed a federal crime. Destroying a U.S. passport was a serious offense that could result in years in prison. But more than that, Patricia had crossed a line that revealed the true depth of her prejudice and abuse of power. You just destroyed my legal identification, Maya said, her voice shaking despite her efforts to stay composed. That was a valid U.S. passport. It was a fake, Patricia insisted, though her voice carried less confidence than before. Perhaps she was beginning to realize the magnitude of what she had just done. Real passports don't tear like that. But Maya knew that wasn't true. While U.S. passports were made of durable materials, they could certainly be torn if someone applied enough force. Patricia had deliberately destroyed government property and was now trying to justify her actions with lies. The other passengers were no longer just uncomfortable, they were outraged. A businessman in line pulled out his own passport and held it up. "This is ridiculous," he said. "Her passport looked exactly like mine. What you just did is completely wrong." An elderly woman nodded in agreement. "I've been flying for 40 years and I've never seen anything like this. That young lady did nothing wrong." But Patricia seemed to be spiraling deeper into her delusion of authority. Instead of backing down or calling for help from a supervisor, she doubled down on her accusations. "I don't care what you people think," she snapped at the supportive passengers. "I'm in charge of this gate, and I won't let terrorists or criminals board flights on my watch." The word terrorist sent a chill through the crowd. Patricia had now escalated from questioning Maya's documents to suggesting she might be a threat to national security. It was an incredibly serious accusation to make against someone whose only crime was trying to board a flight, while Maya felt the weight of every eye in the gate area. Some passengers looked at her with sympathy and outrage on her behalf. Others seemed uncertain, wondering if maybe Patricia knew something they didn't. The power of authority was strong, and even when that authority was being abused, some people found it easier to trust the person in uniform. "Ma'am," Maya said, fighting to keep her voice steady, "I need you to call your supervisor immediately. What you've done here is completely unacceptable, and I want to file a formal complaint." Patricia laughed bitterly. "File a complaint against me? You're the one trying to travel with fake documents. You should be worried about going to jail, not filing complaints." The security officers finally arrived, two men in uniform who looked confused about what they were walking into. Patricia immediately pointed at Maya and launched into an animated explanation of events that bore little resemblance to what had actually happened. "Officers, thank goodness you're here," Patricia sighed, her voice dripping with false concern. "This person tried to board my flight with obviously fraudulent identification. When I challenged her about it, she became belligerent and demanded to speak to my supervisor. I had no choice but to confiscate the fake passport." Maya listened to Patricia's twisted version of events with amazement. According to the gate agent's story, Maya was the aggressor who had been caught trying to commit a crime. There was no mention of the discrimination, the excessive questioning, or the fact that Patricia had destroyed valid government property. One of the security officers, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, looked at Maya sympathetically. "Ma'am, can you tell me your side of what happened here?" Maya took a deep breath, knowing that her next words were crucial. She had to be careful not to reveal her true identity while still defending herself against Patricia's false accusations. "Officer, I presented a valid U.S. passport and boarding pass for my flight to Atlanta. This gate agent subjected me to excessive questioning that she didn't apply to other passengers, then accused me of having fake documents and tore up my passport. I did nothing wrong except try to board my flight." "She's lying," Patricia interrupted. "That passport was obviously fake. Look at how easily it tore when I tested it." The security officer looked confused. "You tore up her passport?" "I confiscated fraudulent identification," Patricia corrected. As if using different words would change the reality of what she had done, several passengers spoke up at once, offering to serve as witnesses to what they had seen. A young man with his phone still recording stepped forward. "Officer, I got the whole thing on video." That gate agent was treating her completely differently from everyone else in line, and there was nothing wrong with her passport. More passengers began volunteering their accounts of what they had witnessed. The security officers found themselves dealing with not just one complaint, but multiple witnesses who were all telling the same story, a story that painted Patricia as the aggressor and Maya as an innocent victim of discrimination. Maya stood quietly while the truth slowly emerged through the testimony of strangers who had chosen to speak up for what was right. She felt a mix of gratitude toward these fellow travelers and sadness that such support was necessary in the first place. The situation was about to take another dramatic turn, one that would reveal the true consequences of Patricia's actions and change everything for everyone involved. Maya watched the security officers trying to make sense of the conflicting stories they were hearing. The two men looked increasingly uncomfortable as more passengers stepped forward to defend her and contradict Patricia's version of events. Their confusion was understandable. They had responded to a call about suspicious documents, but they were finding a situation that looked more like workplace misconduct than criminal activity. Patricia seemed to sense that the situation was slipping away from her control. Her initial confidence was cracking as witness after witness contradicted her claims. The torn passport pieces in her hands were becoming less like evidence of her vigilance and more like proof of her poor judgment. "Officers, you can't listen to these people," Patricia said, her voice rising with desperation. "They don't understand airport security procedures like I do. This woman is obviously running some kind of scam, and these passengers are just falling for it." But even as she spoke, Patricia's arguments were sounding weaker and less convincing. The security officers had been doing their jobs long enough to recognize when someone was making excuses rather than stating facts. They had also noticed that several passengers were recording the interaction, which meant there would be video evidence of whatever had really happened. "Ma'am," one of the officers said to Patricia, "we're going to need to see some documentation about your training in identifying fraudulent passports. Can you show us the certification that qualifies you to make that determination?" The question caught Patricia off guard. She fumbled for an answer, clearly not expecting to be challenged about her supposed expertise. "Well, we received training. It's part of our orientation. Basic ID checking training," the officer pressed. "Or specialized document fraud detection?" Patricia's face reddened as she realized she couldn't answer the question without admitting that she had no special qualifications. Gate agents were trained to check that IDs matched boarding passes and to look for obvious signs of tampering, but they weren't document experts. Patricia had been claiming authority she simply didn't possess. Maya remained quiet during this exchange, letting the security officers do their job. She knew that her moment was coming, but she wanted to let the situation develop naturally. The more Patricia revealed about her lack of proper justification for her actions, the stronger Maya's case would become. That's when she noticed them. 3 people in business attire walking quickly through the terminal toward their gate. Maya recognized them immediately, though she hoped Patricia wouldn't. They were her backup team from the FAA, and their presence meant that her cover was about to be blown. Someone had clearly been monitoring the situation and decided it was time to intervene. Director James Mitchell led the group, a tall man in his 50s with graying hair and the kind of presence that commanded immediate attention. Behind him walked Agent Rodriguez from the Civil Rights Division and Agent Chun from Airport Compliance. Maya had worked with all of them before, and she knew their arrival meant that this incident was about to become official federal business. As the 3 agents approached the gate, other passengers began to notice them too. There was something unmistakably authoritative about the way they moved and dressed that suggested they weren't ordinary travelers. Several people in the boarding line pointed and whispered, wondering what was happening now. Patricia was still arguing with the security officers when Director Mitchell reached the counter. "Excuse me," he said in a voice that immediately commanded everyone's attention. "I'm Director James Mitchell from the Federal Aviation Administration. We understand there's been an incident here involving one of our investigators." The words hit the gate area like a thunderbolt. Passengers gasped, security officers straightened up, and Patricia's face went completely white. Maya could see the exact moment when the gate agent realized that everything she thought she knew about the situation was wrong. "Your investigator?" one of the security officers asked, looking confused. Director Mitchell nodded and gestured toward Maya. This is Senior Investigator Maya Thompson from our Civil Rights Compliance Division. She's been conducting an undercover investigation into discriminatory practices at this airport. The revelation sent shockwaves through the crowd. Passengers who had been filming the incident looked at their phones with new understanding, realizing they had just captured federal evidence of workplace discrimination. Those who had spoken up in Maya's defense felt vindicated, while others who had remained silent looked uncomfortable about what they had. Witness. Patricia stared at Maya in complete disbelief. She's a federal agent? Senior Investigator, Director Mitchell corrected firmly. And the passport you destroyed was legitimate government identification belonging to a federal employee conducting official business. Patricia's legs seemed to give out beneath her, and she grabbed the counter for support. The magnitude of her mistake was finally sinking in. She hadn't just discriminated against an ordinary passenger, she had attacked a federal investigator who was documenting exactly the kind of behavior that could shut down an airline's operations. Agent Rodriguez stepped forward with her credentials out. Ma'am, I need you to understand that destroying a federal employee's passport during an official investigation is a serious crime. You're looking at multiple federal charges, including destruction of government property, obstruction of a federal investigation, and civil rights violations. The passengers around the gate were now completely silent, watching the drama unfold with fascination and horror. Many were still recording, understanding that they were witnessing something that would likely become national news. The businessman who had defended Maya earlier shook his head in amazement at the turn of events. I can't believe this is happening, Patricia whispered, still staring at Maya as if she were seeing a ghost. She looked so young. I thought ... You thought what? Maya spoke for the first time since her colleagues had arrived, her voice steady but filled with controlled anger. You thought that because I'm a young black woman in casual clothes, I couldn't possibly be someone important? You thought it was safe to discriminate against me because I looked like an easy target? Patricia opened her mouth to respond, but no. Words came out. There was nothing she could say that would make her actions defensible. The torn passport pieces were still in her hands, physical evidence of her crime and her prejudice. Director Mitchell addressed the security officers. Gentlemen, we'll need you to secure this area as a crime scene. We'll also need copies of any security footage from the past 2 hours. This incident is now part of an ongoing federal investigation. Agent Chun was already photographing the torn passport and documenting the scene. Maya knew that every detail would be preserved as evidence, not just for Patricia's prosecution, but for the broader investigation into discriminatory practices at the airport. One of the passengers, an older man who had watched the entire incident unfold, approached Director Mitchell. Sir, I recorded most of what happened on my phone. That gate agent was completely out of line from the very beginning. Your investigator handled herself with incredible professionalism under really difficult circumstances. Thank you, Director, Mitchell replied. We'll need to get contact information from you and any other witnesses. Your testimony will be crucial in ensuring that justice is served. Patricia finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. I didn't know. I was just doing my job. I thought ... You thought you could treat people differently based on how they looked, Maya interrupted. You thought you could abuse your authority because you assumed no one would hold you accountable. That's exactly the kind of discrimination we're here to stop. The crowd of passengers began to murmur among themselves, processing what they had witnessed and learned. Many were taking selfies or calling friends to tell them about the incredible scene they had just experienced. Some looked ashamed that they hadn't spoken up sooner, while others felt proud that they had stood up for what was right. Maya looked around the gate area, seeing the faces of dozens of people who would never forget what they had witnessed today. She hoped that some of them would think differently about discrimination in the future, and maybe even speak up when they saw it happening to others. The revelation had changed everything, but the consequences were just beginning. The weeks following the incident at Gate B-12 moved quickly for everyone involved. Maya found herself at the center of a story that spread far beyond Chicago O'Hare Airport. The passenger videos from that day had gone viral within hours, reaching millions of people across social media platforms. News outlets picked up the story, and suddenly everyone was talking about what had happened to the undercover FAA investigator, Patricia Williams, was escorted from the airport in handcuffs that same afternoon. The federal charges against her were serious and numerous. Destroying a federal employee's passport carried a potential sentence of up to 10 years in prison. The civil rights violations added additional years to her potential sentence. But perhaps most damaging of all was the obstruction of a federal investigation charge, which prosecutors took very seriously. Maya watched from her office window as news vans lined up outside the FAA building for the third day in a row. Reporters wanted to interview her, legal experts wanted her opinion on discrimination in aviation, and advocacy groups wanted her to speak at their events. The attention was overwhelming, but Maya knew it served an important purpose. People needed to see that discrimination still happened in places where everyone was supposed to be treated equally. Director Mitchell knocked on her door and entered with a thick folder of documents. The preliminary investigation results, he said, setting the papers on her desk. Patricia Williams had 17 formal complaints filed against her in the past 3 years. 17, Maya. All of them described the same pattern of behavior you experienced. Maya flipped through the complaint files, reading story after story of passengers who had been treated unfairly by Patricia. A Hispanic businessman who was questioned extensively about his travel plans. An elderly Asian woman who was made to prove her identity with multiple documents. A young black mother who was accused of having fake boarding passes for her children. The pattern was unmistakable and heartbreaking. Why? Wasn't anything done about these complaints? Maya asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. That's the most disturbing part, Director Mitchell replied. The complaints were filed with airport management, but they were never properly investigated. Patricia's supervisor dismissed most of them as misunderstandings or communication issues. A few passengers were even told that they were being too sensitive about normal security procedures. Maya shook her head in disgust. The system had failed not just Patricia's victims, but also Patricia herself. If proper action had been taken after the first few complaints, Patricia might have received training or counseling that could have changed her behavior. Instead, her discrimination was allowed to continue and escalate until she committed federal crimes. The investigation had also revealed something that shocked even Maya, who thought she had seen every form of workplace discrimination. Patricia had been keeping a notebook where she rated passengers based on their appearance and ethnicity. The notebook contained crude drawings and offensive comments about travelers she considered suspicious or problematic. When federal agents searched her locker, they found the notebook filled with months of discriminatory observations. Airport management was scrambling to contain the damage to their reputation. The CEO had appeared on 3 different news programs to apologize and promise reforms. New training programs were being developed. Supervision policies were being rewritten, and several managers who had ignored complaints were facing disciplinary action. But Maya knew that real change would take more than corporate apologies and policy updates. The incident had exposed a culture of indifference that allowed discrimination to flourish unchecked. Changing that culture would require sustained effort and accountability at every level. 3 weeks after the incident, Maya received a call that surprised her. It was from Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman who had been in line behind her that day and had spoken up in her defense. Mrs. Henderson explained that she had been flying for 40 years but had never really noticed how differently airlines treated various passengers until she witnessed what happened to Maya. "I've been watching more carefully when I travel now," Mrs. Henderson said, "and I'm ashamed to say that I see it happening all the time. People being treated differently based on how they look or how they're dressed. I never spoke up before, because I thought it wasn't my business. But after seeing what you went through, I realized that staying silent makes me part of the problem." Maya smiled as she listened to Mrs. Henderson describe how she had already intervened twice when she saw airport staff treating passengers unfairly. "You probably prevented someone else from going through what I experienced," Maya told her. "That matters more than you know." The phone calls and emails from passengers were among the most rewarding parts of Maya's job. People from all over the country were sharing their own stories of discrimination and thanking her for bringing attention to the issue. Many said they had never reported their experiences because they assumed nothing would be done. Now they were seeing that their voices could make a difference. Patricia's case moved through the federal court system with surprising speed. Her lawyers tried to negotiate a plea deal, but prosecutors were determined to send a strong message about civil rights violations. The evidence was overwhelming, not just from Maya's incident, but from the pattern of behavior documented in the complaint files and Patricia's own notebook. 6 months after that day at Gate B12, Patricia Williams was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison. She had pleaded guilty to multiple charges in exchange for avoiding a longer trial, but she showed little remorse during her sentencing hearing. Even facing prison time, she maintained that she had been just doing her job and protecting airport security. Maya attended the sentencing hearing, wanting to see justice served but also hoping to understand what had driven Patricia to such extremes. During Patricia's brief statement to the court, Maya heard a woman who seemed completely unable to recognize the harm she had caused. Patricia spoke about airport security and following procedures, but never acknowledged the human cost of her discrimination. The judge, however, had no such blindness. "Miss Williams," she said sternly, "you used your position of authority to humiliate and harm innocent travelers based solely on their race and appearance. You destroyed government property and obstructed a federal investigation. Your actions represent a betrayal of the public trust and a violation of the most basic principles of equal treatment under law." Maya felt a sense of closure as she left the courthouse that day, but she also knew that Patricia's imprisonment was just one small step in a much larger battle. Discrimination didn't happen in isolation. It grew in environments where it was tolerated, ignored, or actively encouraged. Real change would require addressing those environments, not just punishing individual bad actors. The FAA used Maya's investigation as the foundation for a nationwide review of airport discrimination complaints. They discovered that Patricia's case was far from unique. Similar patterns of ignored complaints and discriminatory behavior were found at airports across the country. The review led to new federal requirements for training, reporting, and accountability that affected every commercial airport in America. Maya was promoted to Deputy Director of Civil Rights Compliance 6 months later, a position that gave her the authority to implement many of the changes she had long advocated for. Her first initiative was creating a direct reporting system that allowed passengers to file discrimination complaints with the federal government rather than relying on airlines to police themselves. The torn passport from that day at Gate B12 was preserved as evidence and later displayed in a civil rights exhibit at the Smithsonian Museum. Maya sometimes visited the exhibit when she was in Washington, looking at the framed pieces of her destroyed document and remembering how that moment had changed everything. More importantly, she thought about all the travelers who would never experience what she had gone through, thanks to the reforms that grew out of one terrible day and one person's decision to do the right thing even when it was difficult. That, she knew, was what real justice looked like, not just punishment for wrongdoing, but prevention of future harm. The story of Gate B12 became a case study in law schools and business schools, teaching future lawyers and managers about the importance of addressing discrimination before it escalates. Maya often spoke at these institutions, always ending her presentations with the same message: discrimination thrives in silence, but it dies when people refuse to look away.